Thank you, Richard. And I am thrilled to be joined by James Snowden. So for about 10 years almost, I worked for Devex out on the West Coast in California, covering technology, innovation, and philanthropy in global health and development. And one name that came up very often was Open Philanthropy. So I hope many of you are familiar with Open Phil. And if you're not, and you work in this space, you should be. But in this conversation, we're going to talk with James, who oversees Open Philanthropy's global health and well-being programs on policy and effective altruism. We're going to talk about an exciting new partnership around tackling lead poisoning, which you might have heard about this week. But for Open Philanthropy, this is not new. This is something you've been working on. And we're going to start with lead and then understand how lead reflects the way that Open Philanthropy selects its causes among the many causes where they could direct their quite significant sources of funding. So again, earlier this week, many of you may have seen there was the launch of the Partnership for a Lead-Free Future. It's a coalition of partners across government, business, and philanthropy. But you might be less familiar with Open Philanthropy's role in that. So James, can you tell us more about Open Philanthropy's role in this partnership? And then we'll talk about how, again, this isn't new for you. This is something you've been working on.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Catherine. Yeah, maybe one thing to say up front, this actually started with our sister organization, GiveWell, but before I came to Open Philanthropy. And it's funny, it's nice to be here with Catherine because you were the first journalist who actually gave a damn. And
we did meet years ago when you were at GiveWell. Thank you.
I remember it very well because it was, no one was talking about the issue at the time. And it's been remarkable over the last six months or so to see it really taking off. So maybe just to say about why we have been interested in this area for a while. So Open Philanthropy and GiveWell, very similar organizations. I'll talk about Open Philanthropy because it's probably not that interesting to distinguish. But the main lens we look at the world through is how can we help others the most with the resources available to us. And we're extremely lucky to work with donors who share those values and share those goals. And obviously that's an incredibly difficult question. And so the framework that we use to decide on which programs to launch is centered around 3 pillars. So that's importance, neglectedness, and tractability. So how much does this particular disease, risk factor, cause area, how much damage does it cause? Who else is working on it? And is it possible to make progress? And almost always we get 2 of those, not 3. So lead exposure is one of the most exciting areas that I've ever worked on. And I think it really hits all 3. So just to go through each very briefly. So in terms of importance, current estimates from the Global Burden of Disease Project suggest 1.5 million people every year die from lead exposure. That's more than both HIV and malaria combined, which are 2 extremely neglected diseases in themselves. In terms of how much current attention before the recent launch on lead exposure, under $15 million was our best estimate every year. So that's less than 1,000. Well, that's 1,000 times less than what is spent on comparable problems. And then in terms of tractability, this was something that we were less sure about 5 years ago when I started working on this. But if we really zoom out and look at the global track record on lead exposure, the US in the 1970s, rates of lead exposure were higher than they are anywhere in the world today, almost. And they've now come down over 95%, largely due to the elimination of leaded gasoline. And so it is possible to make progress on this issue, and I'm excited to get started.
So as you mentioned, under 15 million has been spent annually on this issue. And yet another statistic that's come up this week is that 1 in 2 children, half of children in low and middle income countries are affected by lead poisoning. And I want to mention a quote that USAID Administrator Samantha Power said earlier this week that to me connects with importance, neglectedness, and tractability. She said, "Never in my career have I seen such a compelling, low-cost opportunity to make such a massive impact on a major global killer." One of the things I find super interesting about this partnership is, again, for so long having covered the West Coast role in global development, this is an example of Open Philanthropy coming together with USAID, coming together with UNICEF. So can you talk about, again, you've been working on this issue for years. You've been a pretty influential funder in this space because, again, we're only looking at what has been $15 million a year. How did you all come together, and what kind of leverage are you hoping for?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is very unusual for us. I've been working in Open Philanthropy for a few years at GiveWell for many years before that, and our kind of traditionally we've focused on fairly linear theories of change, and so I spent a lot of my career working on bed net distribution or vitamin A supplementation, and those are extremely cost-effective opportunities. But this is a very different type of problem. It's regulatory. That's how you end lead exposure, and so working closely with governments is obviously a crucial part of that. Having said that, I had not expected to be in the position we are now 1 year ago. I would say a lot of it is down to the administrator herself. She's been remarkable on this issue. It's really captured her, and I know she cares personally about it a lot. I also wanted to say Atul Gawande, the assistant administrator, has personally been helping us with this work, and so that's been extremely exciting. And I would just say, I think you probably heard a lot on this stage already. This is not the best time in the world for to be launching a new program, given the current state of global aid budgets and replenishments coming around the corner. And I think this is an opportunity for philanthropists to step up. And so I think what USAID has really brought to the table, as well as the funding which it's provided, it committed $25 million on Monday, which is a huge impact that we think we could have with that. But really, what Samantha Power can do is very different from what we can do as philanthropists. She can talk to heads of state. There were, I believe, 27 heads of state on Monday who committed to end lead exposure by 2040, and that's just not a position that I would have guessed we were in a year ago.
You all bring different things to the table, and just to be very clear about Open Phil's role, part of what you bring is resources and experience working with other donors to kind of collect resources. So this Partnership for a Lead-Free Future that launched this week, it's a $150 million initiative. $104 million of that comes from the Lead Exposure Action Fund, a collaborative fund run by Open Philanthropy. So just to be very clear about your very influential role here. I also want to just quickly understand the strategy. So you mentioned a lot of this is about regulatory issues. And you've mentioned there are 3 pillars to the strategy here: measurement, mitigation, and mainstreaming. So can you talk with us a little bit about that? And I think many people in this room are familiar with the progress the US has made, but there's also been progress in low and middle income countries, success stories we can build on. We need many more of them. But tell us about that strategy and what's an example of progress that you want to see more of?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Yeah, so as you said, there are 3 pillars to our strategy. So measurement, mitigation, and mainstreaming. So measurement, we need to understand this problem. That there are 2 parts to that. One is getting nationally representative blood lead level surveys completed. Very, very few countries in the world, even high-income countries, run these surveys. They're not that expensive. We can get them done. And that's the basis, not just for understanding the problem, but that's how you know which kids are exposed, who should you be following up with? So it's not just about establishing a baseline. It's not just about collecting the data. This is actually part of the intervention itself. The second part of measurement is understanding where the sources are coming from. So, in the past, leaded gasoline has been an enormous problem. And then more recently, we've started to find other issues that, weren't on my radar, at least. Things like lead being added to spices. Lead in paint is an issue that the US has been dealing with for a long time. And then in the mitigation piece, we want to focus on the low-hanging fruit while also working with governments to establish systems to address sources of exposure that might not be that easy, right? So one of the challenging things about this area, while I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, it's not clear where the lead is coming from right now. We have our hypotheses that there are lots of suspects. This could be an easier or harder problem depending on what is actually causing the exposure. But maybe to zoom in on a couple of things that I think are quite easy.
Great.
So one of them is paint. Many countries in the world still don't have regulation against paint, and even in countries where there are regulations on the books, they're very poorly enforced. And so one of my favorite grantees, it's an amazing organization called the Lead Exposure Elimination Project. And so they will go into countries, and just for a few $1,000s, they can run surveys in marketplaces and test paint for lead. And what they've very broadly found is even in countries where they have regulations on the books, they are not being enforced. There is still lead in paint. But the good news is that it is not hard to reformulate paint. There are many alternatives to this. It's an incredible, when you just kind of zoom out and think what we're doing when we are painting our walls with lead, that is a problem that will last 10, 20, 50, potentially hundreds of years into the future. That doesn't go away. When that building is demolished, all of that lead is still there. So this is a really kind of very long timescale preventative intervention, which is extremely exciting.
And you mentioned spices, for example. I know that in researching this and talking with you, I learned that part of why lead is added to turmeric, or the reason why lead is added to turmeric, is to make turmeric more yellow.
Yeah.
So perhaps with that change, children and families won't be eating lead in turmeric if we can just accept a slightly less yellow color, for example.
Exactly. Yeah, I didn't even know yellow turmeric was meant to be better. So this was a real learning experience for me as well. I came across this issue. I want to give a lot of credit to a Stanford PhD, PhD student at the time. She did her PhD on lead exposure in Bangladesh. And what she found working with local collaborators, particularly ICDDRB, is that it seemed like a lot of the exposure that kids were facing literally came from lead chromate being added to turmeric post-production to make it more yellow so that it would fetch a very slightly higher price on the market. And so the nice thing about this issue is that there is not a big corporate opposition to removing lead from turmeric. There is not a pro-lead spices lobby. Mm-hmm. And so she worked very closely with the Bangladeshi government, and it was very easy to name and shame people who were doing this and to roll it up the supply chain. And within a couple of years, the blood lead levels in a nationally representative survey of children nearby had declined by about 30%. It's very hard to estimate the lives saved from this, but my best estimate is that intervention will have saved 20,000 lives over the next 5 years at a cost of under $100 per life saved.
It's a great example. In closing, we did a deep dive on lead poisoning because it's very newsy, and Open Philanthropy, is coming out in a big way in this big partnership around lead. Again, the reason we're talking lead poisoning is, one, it's an important issue. Two, it reflects how you select causes, importance, neglectedness, and tractability. And just putting myself in the shoes of people in this room and tuning in online, they might be wondering, how can I get on Open Phil's radar, right? My issue is important, it's neglected, it's tractable. Just quickly, let's close with a preview of, in addition to lead poisoning, what are some other things you're looking at or things we should look out for?
Oh gosh, so many things. Well, first of all, I'll say that we do not see ourselves as the objective arbiter of truth over what the most cost-effective work is, even though that's what we are trying to aim at. Some other areas that I think are extremely exciting and neglected. I mean, air quality is just something that has been, it kills millions and millions of people every year and is still, I think, structurally neglected. And so maybe that's the one that I would, particularly call out.
Well, I want to thank you, James, for joining us. And I'll have a few quick closing remarks, but please join me in thanking James for his time. And we look forward to following your work. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine.